Hi, everybody. I'm Matthew Teitelbaum, the Anne and Graham Gunn Director of your Museum of Fine Arts, and it's really meaningful to us that you've chosen to spend your Sunday with us, so thank you for being here. It's pretty exciting. I've had a conversation with Sebastian once before in public. I've had plenty of conversations with him privately. There should be a law against somebody being so nice and smart. I just have to say that. The two, you know, I don't know. But anyway, I'm really glad we're doing this again. As you know, we're going to hear Sebastian talk a little bit about his new book, Paris in Ruins, Love, War, and the Birth of Impressionism. And I will ask him some questions around that. In addition to being a friend of the MFA, by the way, sometimes a critical... Okay. Is this better? Yes. Do you want me to start again? No, I'm not going to. In addition to being a great friend, and sometimes a tough friend, he is a very thoughtful engager with an institution like the Museum of Fine Arts. He is a Pulitzer Prize winning critic for the Washington Post. He's the author of Side by Side, Picasso versus Matisse, which he wrote in 2002, Lucian Freud, which he wrote in 2007, and The Art of Rivalry, Four Friendships, Betrayals, and Breakthroughs in Modern Art. He worked at the Boston Globe with great pride and pleasure for us from 2008 to 2016. He teaches at Wellesley College and has previously worked in London and Sydney for the Daily Telegraph in the UK, The Guardian, The Spectator, the Sydney Morning Herald, the Australian, and the Monthly. And now, as you know, he is the art critic for the Washington Post. I'm going to say it again. Andy's a really nice guy. So Sebastian is with me, and what I thought, Sebastian sent me a number of slides earlier this week, and they were so compelling in the sequence, I thought I'd just ask him to tell us a story, walk us through it, give us a overview of the book, why you chose these images, and then we'll ask some questions.
Sure thing. Well, first of all, I just want to say how honestly, I just truly happy I am to be here. Thank you all so much for coming out on a cold Sunday. Thank you, Matthew, and the MFA for having me here. Thanks to Karen and Kristen and all the staff who've made this possible. It's a real pleasure for me. So yeah, I mean, I've written this book, and since we have some nice pictures, I thought also that would be a nice idea to just spin you through it, and then we can get into a conversation. But you know, the book is really, it came out of my love of two great artists, artists I've written about before, both for the newspapers I've written for and also in an earlier book, Berthe Morisot and Édouard Manet, and I'm sure you know both of them. This is the first picture I'm speaking to just because this is the first painting that Manet did of Berthe Morisot. He met her in 1868-69, and we believe they were in the Louvre. And as soon as he saw her, she reminded him of some of the figures in some of his favorite paintings by Goya. Manet was in love with all things Spanish, and especially the Spanish painters, Velázquez and Goya. And so he said, would you like to pose for a picture that I want to do, which will be an homage to Goya? And she said yes. And so this is the painting. Many of you may know it. It's in the Musée d'Orsay. But from that point, they developed a close relationship. We can talk more about that. But the thing to know, I guess, about Morisot at that point is that she had been painting for many years already and had had great success. She'd shown at multiple salons, and the salons were the annual showcase, if you like, for all the latest art, the place where you had to show if you wanted to succeed as an artist. And she had a sister, and her sister Edma was also a painter. Some said even better than Berthe Morisot. But just around the time that she met Manet, just shortly before really, Edma had met and married a naval officer and had left Paris and had a baby. This is a picture that Berthe Morisot did of Edma and the baby. It's a detail, by the way. It's probably Berthe Morisot's best-known painting, The Cradle. It was done a few years later, but I've just included it just to be able to mention Edma, because I think her story is quite poignant in the sense that you had two very talented sisters. One of them got married, had a baby, and really had to give up painting. And the other was still single at the age of 29, which is when she met Manet. And then went through an enormously traumatic set of events, which I'm about to talk about, and then resolved at the end of that to commit herself to painting. And became arguably the most important female painter of the 19th century and a key figure in the Impressionist movement. The traumatic events I mentioned were the siege of Paris and the Commune. Just to sketch it in very quickly, France under Napoleon III very unwisely chose to declare war on neighboring Prussia and found itself very quickly fighting a sort of rearguard action on its own soil. They lost one battle after another, and at Sedan, Napoleon III, a huge battle there, he surrendered and was sent into exile in the UK. And before Paris knew it, it was being descended upon by German-speaking troops who besieged the city. It was a long siege, 4 to 5 months. There was initially great optimism because Paris was mostly Republican. They were anti-Napoleon III. They wanted France to be a more democratic country, and having him surrender and go into exile meant that they could declare a republic in Paris. But of course, from the beginning, it was a republic in a state of crisis, emergency, and they had to find a way to defeat this besieging force. One of the problems they encountered was the fact that there could be no way to get communications out until a friend of Manet, a man called Nadar, came up with the idea of sending up balloons. And so this is a painting that shows the Republican leader, Léon Gambetta, leaving Paris from the hill at Montmartre with some pigeons in tow and a lot of letters that had been addressed to people outside. His job was to try to reconstitute the defeated French army and come back and beat the besieging forces from outside. At the same time, almost the entire male population within the city joined the National Guard, and that included artists like Manet and Degas, and they hoped to break out from within the city and open up the Prussian lines and defeat them that way. So there was tremendous optimism at first. But it was the coldest winter in living memory. People were gradually reduced to starvation and illness, and there was a bombardment towards the end of the siege. And this is one of the few works of art that Manet made during the siege. It's a picture that shows people lining up for food. Food just ran out. The population was reduced to eating rats and pigeons, and it was really just a terrible set of circumstances. So finally, they surrendered. And then after a little interim period where food came into the city, there was a radical sort of left-wing revolt. And a new government was established in Paris. The French government forces were forced once again to leave, and a commune was declared. The leaders of this revolution issued a series of edicts. They were very idealistic in many ways and tried to create a new society. But again, they were doing it in a situation of crisis because French government forces were now besieging the city and were planning their sort of re-entry into the city. That happened after a couple of months, and it was an unbelievably violent week. It's still known as Bloody Week, in fact, when the French army came back into the city and crushed the communards, as they were called. This is a photograph of the time of a barricade. This is a lithograph, a detail of a lithograph Manet made in the aftermath. It shows government forces executing the communards. They did this on an enormous scale, summary executions all over the city. As many as 15,000, 20,000 communards are said to have been killed in this week of fighting. This is the Rue de Rivoli. Many of you may have walked along it as you make your way from hot chocolate at Angelina's to the Louvre. This is what it looked like during this week. As the communards retreated, they set fire to buildings, some of the most important buildings in Paris, including the Hôtel de Ville and the stock exchange, the Bourse. Even, the Louvre actually was lucky to escape. It was an unbelievable week. And in the aftermath, I think people were shell-shocked. I think I should stop talking there, and we should, I've got a few more slides we can flick to, but I guess the book ends with the very first Impressionist exhibition. If any of you have been able to get down to DC over the last few months, you may have seen a show that's all about this first Impressionist exhibition. And it's really the tale of two exhibitions, because it puts together works from that exhibition with works that showed at the Salon of that same year, the 1874 Salon. And this work, many of you will know because it belongs to the MFA, was the work that won the highest prize at that year's Salon. And what's interesting about the show is that it also includes Monet's Impression Sunrise. In fact, that hangs right next to this work by Jean-Léon Gérôme. And it gives you an idea of the two different styles that were sort of competing. But what the show does in DC, or what it did, is it finished? I think it has. It's just finished, yeah. It complicates our idea of this. We have this idea of the Impressionist avant-garde against the very conservative Salon. There's a lot of truth to that, but there were many paintings that showed at the Salon that year that could easily have been in the Impressionist show, and vice versa. It was a messier story than people realize, and the show did a great job of showing that. Manet exhibited this painting, The Railway. Again, it's a detail, but he exhibited that not at the first Impressionist show, but at the Salon. And that's very interesting, because he's known, of course, as the father of Impressionism, but he chose never to show with the Impressionist group through all of their 8 iterations of their exhibitions over the 1870s and 1880s. And he advised Berthe Morisot not to show as well. She had been invited by Degas to join the group. Manet and many of the people around Berthe Morisot thought this was a terrible idea, and we can talk about why, but I think it just shows how courageous she was to go against all that advice and to join this breakaway group. There was a lot at stake for her, but she joined them, and I think history has shown that that was a good decision for her, because she's definitely one of the stars of Impressionism. And this is, I said I was going to end, but I'm at the end of the slide, so this is one of her best paintings. It's a painting that she did on her honeymoon. It's actually of her husband, Eugène Manet, not Édouard, but Eugène, and that's because unable to marry Manet, I mean, I personally think they were in love. He was already married. Many of you may have seen the show at the Gardner recently that is a lot about Manet's family. But in any case, Berthe Morisot ended up marrying his brother. And this is her on her honeymoon on the Isle of, this is him on their honeymoon on the Isle of Wight, and one of her more beautiful paintings. And this is just a picture that's a favorite of mine by her. It shows the influence, I think, of the French 18th century artists like Watteau and Boucher, but it's of her sister Edma again, just watering some plants at the back of the house. So thank you for listening to that long monologue, but at least you have some idea of what the book's about now, and we can talk and have more of a conversation.
I'm going to go off script already. Why don't you just keep going? In the book, you do the dust jacket for the book, whoever wrote it, talks about Impressionism that comes out of this moment of conflict. You never quite say it as boldly as that, but just share your thoughts about the relationship of the birth of Impressionism to that catastrophic year and the aftermath in Paris just before.
Right, absolutely. I mean, that is something that the book ends up being about, in a sense, but I approach it tentatively, just because I think we all know, right? It's very hard to draw straight lines between political events and the art that emerges from that time, whether it be visual art or music or anything. And yet there are connections there, right? There clearly are. I often think it's similar to, I've said this before, but I think it's similar in some ways to the ways psychologists talk about our responses to traumatic events. You know, there are so many different possible responses, and they have terms like denial or sublimation, projection, and I do think it can be the same way in the arts. You know, to me, it was clear there must have been some sort of effect that these incredibly traumatic events had on the artists who became the Impressionists, and especially on Manet and Degas. Why? I mean, I think you can come at it from a couple of directions. One of them is just psychological, but let's just talk about the political side first of all. I mean, I don't think people often realize that almost all the Impressionists were Republicans, small R Republicans. They wanted France to be more democratic. Manet was a passionate Republican. He'd made paintings that were overtly critical of Napoleon III, who was an authoritarian leader. One of them is here in the Museum of Fine Arts. It's one of his versions of the execution of Maximilian, which was an overt criticism of Napoleon III and was understood as such at the time and was censored. So all of the other Impressionists who were following Manet were very influenced not only by his painting style and his personality, but by his politics. And when they first exhibited, they were written about in Republican journals by Republican critics, and they were associated, in fact, with the left-wing communards, you know, who had been at the heart of this very traumatic, short-lived revolution. In the wake of, after the commune had been crushed, unrepentant communards, those who'd survived and those who hadn't been sent to prison in New Caledonia, were referred to as intransigents. And interestingly, that's exactly the same word that was used by critics to describe the Impressionists. Before the term Impressionism emerged, they were frequently referred to as intransigents. So there was this link, there was this political link. And that's one of the reasons Manet didn't want to be associated with that breakaway exhibition, because it was seen in some ways as analogous to the breakaway commune, if you like. And he thought there was great danger for everyone to be associated with the communards. So there's no question, to get back to painting styles, there's no question that, you know, the elements stylistically of Impressionism were in place before 1870-71, before these traumatic events. A lot of people, if they were asked to name the first Impressionist painting, might name something that Monet painted alongside Renoir on the banks of the Seine just the previous year. But to me, there's no question that this new style, which I feel is in so many ways about transience and the ephemeral effects of light and so on, but also in terms of subject matter, a very democratic style of painting. It's not interested in the picturesque, it's not interested in political rhetoric or other kinds of grandiloquence. It's about everyday scenes, it's about showing every you know, kind of person from all the different classes and so on of French society. All these things start to really solidify after these traumatic events. And so I feel, and I try to tease out in the book, the ways in which these things must be in some ways connected.
I'm going to come back to the book, but I'm going to pause for a moment. What time of day do you write?
After I'm caffeinated. The morning, definitely the morning. I don't know if I'm in the majority there of writers, but I do get the sense that I might be. I know there are some people who can stay up really late at night, but for me, it's hard to get much done productively in terms of putting sentences together after about 1 o'clock. But I'm up very early. You know, I'm up before the rest of the family, usually at sort of 5:36. And I make myself some coffee, and then I get on with it. And I do feel like it's a case of diminishing returns as the hours go by.
And do you have an office, or do you just do it in the living room? Like, where do you write?
Yeah, look, I mean, this is terribly sort of boring in one sense, but
I'm not asking if you're still wearing your pajamas. I'm only asking where you write.
I move around a lot inside the house. It's not a big house. I live in an apartment in Somerville, Somerville, but I used to get terrible back problems, and I spent years trying to get the right kind of chair and the right kind of desk at the right kind of height, all the ergonomics and everything. And I found that actually just sitting in a couch and sort of starting to recline a bit if I get tired, or moving upstairs to my bed and propping a pillow up behind me with my legs straight. I mean, it's ridiculous, but I've found that I've had no back problems for years now because I just move around. I think the whole problem was just sitting like this for hours on end. No matter how good the ergonomics were, it was just that business of being still. So there you go, there's your answer.
So when you're writing criticism, you see an exhibition, you think about it, you might have a conversation or not. You might look at a book or two just to sort of get a fact, but otherwise your narrative comes out of your response and how you put it into a frame of thinking. When you do a book, the research is a bit different. So talk a bit about the research for this book and how you did it.
It is definitely a bit different. I mean, this book is certainly linked to the work I've done for newspapers and magazines and so on. I mean, I think it was really seeing a Berthe Morisot retrospective in Quebec City that crystallized my idea for this book. Just thinking about what she had been through, the historical circumstances, the personal circumstances. And I'd written a lot about Manet and Morisot before, reviewing exhibitions. This book, a lot of the hump of the writing of it was done over COVID, to be honest. So I was very restricted in travel. Luckily, I'd lived, for a brief period, about 5 months in Paris, when my wife ran off to join the circus and was kind enough to invite me along. So I got to know the geography of Paris, I think, during that time and on subsequent visits. So I could picture things a lot. I relied a lot on places like the Musée Marmottan Monet. Some of you may have visited, but it holds a lot of the Berthe Morisot material. They were very helpful to me. And the Musée Carnavalet, which is a sort of museum for the history of Paris, also really valuable. But I was doing almost all the work from my house in Somerville and relying on great scholars, great historians, great art historians, and lots of exhibition catalogs. I mean, I really wanted to, I'm not a professional art historian, I'm an art critic, and I felt if I can contribute anything, it's not much, but it's just being able to do something that I haven't really seen done elsewhere, which is just tying together the experiences of the artists with the wider experience. I mean, my sense is that whenever I read about Impressionism or go to exhibitions, they'll usually mention the Franco-Prussian War and the Commune, but it tends to be a paragraph or a page or a brief chapter at most, and they skip over it. And vice versa, when you have histories of the siege and the Commune, they might mention Manet or some of the writers like Victor Hugo or Edmond de Goncourt, but they don't really get you inside the creative mind during such a traumatic time. And I really wanted to tie those things together. And one of the things I did was just to create a chronology so that I knew from the letters, which of course were also a very important source, from the letters of Morisot and Manet, what was going on in the wider picture on the days they wrote those letters. And doing that really helped me get an understanding of just the things they were referring to in their letters that hadn't made sense. But when you understood what was going on in the wider picture, you thought, oh, that's it. And that really knitted together the two things for me.
So I'm going to stay in the writing piece, and I'm going to come back to just what you've set up, which is this book and all the rest. You work with editors. Are editors your friend or your enemy?
In my case, very much my friend. And I don't believe I have an editor in the audience, so I'm not just saying that to, to protect my job. I do remember a friend of mine, a terrific writer at the Globe, Mark Feeney, saying to me, he said, editors come in three kinds. Let me get this right. They're either like a trampoline, where it's like you jump in and your prose bounces back higher and better than ever, and it's fantastic, it's exhilarating. Or they're like a safety net, where, they won't do much to improve what you've written, but if you make any gross errors of fact or style or just taste, they'll correct you, and that's great. You know, it's great to have a safety net. And then he said, and there are some editors, they're like flypaper. You know, like you give them your copy and you just kind of get stuck, and it's like this endless back and forth and frustration and everything. I've been really lucky. I thought that was being a fellow writer, he understood it, and he's a terrific editor too. But I've been very lucky with my editors, and I'm so grateful for them. I don't think it's a job I'd love to do myself. So when you sense that someone enjoys it and is stimulated by it, and then has good judgment, I'm enormously grateful.
So I'm going to give a fact, not an opinion. You write beautifully. Okay.
That's very kind. Thank you.
So what writing inspires you?
Well, that's a great question. I mean, I've obviously read lots of art criticism, and you know, when I was a student in my 20s, growing up in Australia, you couldn't avoid reading Robert Hughes, and I still really admire the robustness and sort of clarity and color in his writing. I was lucky to get to know Peter Sheldal, the New Yorker's art critic who died a couple of years ago, and become a friend of his, and completely different writer, completely different personality to Robert Hughes, but I still pick up his pieces and just marvel at the use of language. I really do. But you know, my chief love, I would say, is fiction. You know, I mean, I think I notice a lot of people my age, maybe especially guys, stop reading fiction and they're reading more and more nonfiction, and I get that. But for me, great novels are still and short stories are still the thing that I get the most out of. And in a way, you know, with this book, to me, it felt novelistic. You know, I've tried to stick to the facts. I like to imagine that Manet and Morisot were in love, and I think there is some evidence for that. But I was very careful not to overstate that because we don't know. And I think it's very important when writing history to be clear about what we don't know. But certainly the bones of the story felt novelistic to me. You know, it's interesting that. Yeah, no, I'll leave it there. But I love fiction.
You got interested in Robert Hughes and Peter Sheldal once you were doing art criticism, but you wanted to be a writer before you were an art critic. I'm presuming.
You mean a fiction writer?
A writer. You wanted to use words to express something.
Yeah, that's
true. So talk
true.
about that moment and who you were reading then and what world you wanted to be in.
Yeah, that's a really great question. I did read a lot of fiction and short stories, but I also read essays, personal essays that were not necessarily about art. In fact, I think probably the earliest people I was reading were writing film criticism or just personal essays about completely different subjects. I read The New Yorker a lot. I read you know, Australian magazines and British magazines as well. And I just responded to that sort of strong first-person voice where I learned something about the world. But in a way, I felt I was learning, even more than learning facts, I was learning about emotional responses and psychological responses to the world. And I think essays can do that, can't they? In a really fresh, direct way. You know, it can be a very personal way of writing. And I think criticism at its best has that personal quality, this feeling of, all right, the person's just had an experience and they want to tell you about it. It's fresh news. It has that urgency, hopefully, of fresh news. And it's unmediated by all the obligations to inform the reader. Or, you know, I write a column every 2 weeks where I respond just to a single work of art. I used to do it at the Globe. It was called Frame by Frame, and I do it at the Post now. And, you know, I try to share what I learn about each picture that I write about, but only up to a point. You know, I'm not trying, it would be absurd in 500-600 words to try and say anything definitive about a great work of art. Facts are important though, so I try and share them, but what I really want to get across is just the feeling of, here I am, I've just had a personal experience with a work of art. I've gone home, it's stuck around in my head. I maybe pick up a book to look at it again in reproduction. And I want to tell you about it. And you know, sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't, but I think it's that ideal of having a sort of direct communication with an audience. And that's what I aspire to, but I think that's because it's what I responded to most strongly when I was starting out.
I'm going to see if I can weave that back in. Okay, so now let's pivot to this book. So you're in the world, you're looking at a lot of art, you're thinking about a lot of things, and you come back to Morisot and Manet, and you decide something in you compels you to do a book where you're not reading a lot of original French sources, you're not taking a 6-month sabbatical and going to a library, you're writing something which suggests to me you either had a curiosity about something you want to unpack, or a thesis you want to prove, or a hunch about that relationship between the times and the art. So what was it, of all the things you could have written about during COVID, and what brought you back into this subject? What was compelling to you?
I think the things that I learned along the way became incredibly compelling. Learning more about, you know, this political dimension to Impressionism, understanding the complexities of French politics at this time, all became more and more fascinating to me. I mean, for instance, you know, we have a tendency to sort of see politics, you know, especially in our times, right, in very polarized ways. But it was incredibly complex in France at the time. You had two kinds of Republicans. You had the moderate Republicans and the radical Republicans. The radicals, you know, were the ones who staged the revolt that became the commune. Manet was sort of on the cusp, I would say, of radical and moderate. But then you had the Bonapartists who supported Napoleon III, and of course the whole history through the 19th century of the earlier Bonaparte and then Napoleon III. And then you had, you know, two kinds of royalists. You had people who wanted France to be a constitutional monarchy along the lines of Britain, and those who wanted, the Bourbons, who wanted a return to an absolute monarchy. So you got these five, you know, groups, and you could subdivide all of them as well. And all of that became incredibly fascinating to me. But none of that would be a truthful response, I think, to your question, which is what was the original impetus. And it sounds cheesy to say, but it is honestly just the feeling I had that I was slightly in love with Berthe Morisot and with Manet. I mean, I've loved their paintings for a very long time. I've written about probably 10 or 15 Manet exhibitions and individual works of art. And by now, you know, probably a similar number of Morisot exhibitions and individual works of art. And I just felt very moved by their story. I think that the sequence of portraits that Manet did of Berthe Morisot, this is probably the best known of them in the Musée d'Orsay, but it's one of a sequence that he did in between the end of the Commune and the first Impressionist exhibition about 2.5, 3 years later. That sequence of portraits is one of the greatest records of human intimacy, I think, in human history. And I know that's a big claim to make. We could probably look at some examples of great music, great books, great letters, but to me, the directness and tenderness and vitality and gorgeousness in these portraits is just so incredibly poignant and moving. And I just wanted to get inside that and get a sense of in what context this happened. You know, when you read War and Peace or Anna Karenina or I've just picked up Vasily Grossman's Life and Fate, actually, which is a kind of attempt to redo War and Peace around the Battle of Stalingrad. But what's moving about these great novels, I think, is the sense you have of life and the complications of life, almost the sort of Chekhovian complications of life going on even as massive world historical events swirl around you. And that's something that gets forgotten when we read histories of the Holocaust, or of the First World War, or of whatever. You can be so overwhelmed by the magnitude of the bigger events that you can lose track of intimacy, of how intimacy unfolds within the roar of history. And I've failed. I really feel I've failed, but I want that impulse was the main one, to try to get at something like that. And that's why I speak of, being influenced by literature and by fiction, because I think fiction does a better job, apart from, I was going to say a better job than anything, but apart from great painting, at getting at some of that stuff, I think.
So it occurred to me as I was reading your book that there is a part of you that must be fearless. And what I mean by, and by the way, I think the other side is a little bit of anxiety. But the fearlessness is, as you said, you're not an art historian, you're not an academic, you're a library guy, but I'm going to say it again, you didn't sit in a library for 12 hours a day with 25 books around you, right?
And I don't speak French. It is terrible.
Right, okay.
I mean, I'll just say, I've got some French I can read fairly well, but I'm from a family, who are all fluent in French. My sister is a professional translator from French to English. She's translated many books, including book-length poems. My mother, who is Swedish, when she met my father, they met in Geneva and they courted in French. My mother went on to become a French teacher, and my father, who became a principal, he was more of a classicist, but one of his many languages is French, and taught French as well. So I'm very much the runt of the litter in that sense. And it's, I expected to become more fluent during the writing of this than I did, but it would be a lie to say that I can handle French, because, it's a real struggle. So yeah, I'm just getting in ahead if you're about to go there. I just wanted everyone to know that I'm happy to admit it, but I am somewhat ashamed as well.
I just want to say that I'm a museum director and not a psychoanalyst, so I'm going to be light on this guy. But I want to keep going on that. You dive in, you go into a place that is somewhat comprehensively written about. You believe you can find your place, which you do. So talk about talk about fearlessness or courage that gave you the belief that, if I just get in there, I'm going to find the story that can be told in a way that I can tell it.
I think what you really mean is shamelessness, right? No, it's, look, I think you have to be kind of shameless just being a critic. You go from one subject to the next from week to week, all through the period of writing this book, which I think is close to 200,000 words. I probably wrote a similar number of words just for newspapers on a whole range of different subjects. I mean, it can go from video art 1 minute to ancient Egyptian art the next, and it's absolutely what I love about the job. But you do have to be kind of shameless. I mean, especially living in a city like this, I'm always conscious that I never dare condescend to anyone. I mean, in a newspaper, you have to write for a general audience, obviously, and I'm always, corrected by editors if I use, jargon or technical words. But, I'm always so conscious that I'm writing for, at the Boston Globe, I was so aware that I was writing for an audience that would include people who knew 10 times as much as I did about the subject at hand. So, you do have to be shameless. And I remember Peter Sheldale actually saying, there's nothing I know that I didn't learn about on deadline. And, I often feel like that. And so, you think, well, if I can do all this, then I can write a book too. After all, I've been writing about these artists for ages, and I've seen so many exhibitions, and their works are in all the permanent collections, and I've read all those wall labels. And then, of course, you realize there's more to it, and it's incredibly humbling. I found the writing of this book the most difficult thing that I've done, and I really, towards the end, I was swearing to, not only to myself, but to my wife and my kids and everyone around me, I'm never going to try anything like this again. I was having such a miserable time with it. And yet now it's a funny sort of thing. I feel at least a bit proud that it's out there, and just feel like I may have achieved what I wanted to do, which is just to tell this story. But it's certainly not a work of scholarship that's going to go down, in history, I don't think.
Well, I'm still going to get my book signed. There's a book signing afterwards. You went in part because you were in love with the paintings of Morisot and Manet. You had experienced them, you had spent time with them, and in writing this book, you spent even more time with them. So talk a bit about whether you fell more in love, whether you found out something new, whether you still have questions you want to go. So 3 parts. Yeah. More in love, less in love. Are there things that you're even more curious about now?
Absolutely more in love. I can honestly say that. It just, many of you here will know, you get into a subject, and the further you get into it, the more you realize is there and the deeper it gets. And that's certainly the case with these artists that I love. Some of the things I started thinking a lot about were what accounts for the change in Manet's style. He doesn't really look like an impressionist through the 1860s, right? You can see that he's loosened up his brush strokes. He's very influenced by Franz Hals, by Velázquez, nearer his time by Delacroix, all of whom used loose brush strokes and so on. You can tell he's also influenced by Baudelaire and just by Paris, Second Empire Paris, and he's wanting to paint more and more contemporary subjects. But most of his best-known pictures in the 1860s aren't really about contemporary subjects. They're sort of incredibly sly, knowing, funny, self-aware riffs on art historical subjects. Like Olympia, yes, she may be a contemporary courtesan in some ways, but she's very much a reference to a Baudelaire poem and to a painting by Titian, the Venus of Urbino. And he's kind of having fun with it. He's mixing it all up, and there's very little that looks like Impressionism as we think of it when we think of Monet, for instance. But that changes in the wake of this terrible year where, he had joined the National Guard. Did I mention that? I can't remember. He and Degas did join the National Guard. They'd lost a dear friend and colleague, Frederic Bazille, who had died in the Franco-Prussian War. Everything about the situation was they were sobered up, if you like, by the trauma of what they'd gone through. Berthe Morisot was lucky to escape with her life. She became very ill and near starvation. And Manet, too, he saw, I think, really only one night of action, but he also could have been killed. The bombs were flying around him. So they've gone through this whole thing. And then you have this thing where you look at Manet's paintings and it does start to look more and more impressionistic. And there's a famous set of, a short period where he's actually painting together with Monet, and so there's obviously a mutual influence going on there. But he's also looking closely at Berthe Morisot, who had been best known for her landscapes before this traumatic year, but was now painting more and more sort of portraits, interiors, domestic scenes, gardens. She's much more interested in the human figure, but she's doing it in incredibly open brushstrokes, capturing very ephemeral and fleeting effects of light. She's interested in girls and girls on the cusp of sort of adolescence or adolescence on the cusp of adulthood. She's looking at women in the privacy of their own homes, getting dressed and looking in the mirror, all sorts of sort of transitional states, if you like. And I really feel there's a lot of evidence. There's going to be an exhibition by a former curator here, Emily Beanie, later this year that's all about Manet and Morisot. And I'm not sure what she's going to reveal there, but I think she's going to show that, I would guess she's going to show that Morisot was as much an influence on Manet as the other way around, and that they were both profoundly affected by what they'd gone through. And so, yeah, that's something that I got to thinking about more and more as I wrote the book, and I'm still thinking about and fascinated by now.
So the old dinner party question, not who you want to have to a dinner party, but let's say they come to a dinner party, and you've been thinking. There are 2 or 3 questions that you haven't resolved. What would you want to ask them?
The first one's easy. That would be, and you would hope that they would be willing to share this sort of intimate information, but did you have an affair? Or at least, were you in love? That would be the first question.
That would be easier to ask them in French than in English.
Yeah,
but
yeah.
I mean, but
I'll
okay,
have to
got it.
work on
Okay.
that. I'll have to work on that. I think, I mean, I would love to be at a dinner with Berthe Morisot and her family, actually. I mean, the letters that she exchanged with her sister Edma, but also her other sister Eve and her mother Cornélie were just, you know, I really recommend you getting the volume and reading it yourself. They're so lively. They're by turns sort of melancholy, a bit sort of gossipy, even bitchy, if you like, and full of sort of just vitality. I mean, she talks about reading Darwin. Imagine being a sort of unmarried 29-year-old woman from an upper middle class family in Paris, and everyone's reading Darwin, and she reads it, and she has some comments about that, and she talks about loving Shakespeare's women. You know, what is it that which women you want to ask? Like, what is it that, you know, she was incredibly intelligent, lively, and I think sort of a bit stormy, a bit tempestuous, not in a sort of theatrical way, but just a lot of feelings roiling around within her. You can almost see it when you look at paintings like, if you've been down to Providence, to RISD, the museum at RISD, that fantastic collection there, they have a painting by Manet of Morisot, and she's sitting on the couch. There's a sort of Japanese print that Manet sketched in behind her, but she's almost sort of squirming underneath her sort of voluminous white skirts with energy, with sort of impatience. It's like she doesn't want to just sit there and be a model. She wants to paint, and she wants to talk, and she wants to, you know, just get into life. That's the feeling I have anyway. You can feel how sort of unsettled she is, but there's a sensuousness and an intelligence, I think, at the same time that's so affecting. But I'm not answering your question, really. I mean, I don't know what else I'd ask them. I guess you'd have to ask Manet whether he was the biological father of Leon, which is what the Gardner show, if you've seen it, is all about. I tend to feel, I think the show, it's a brilliant show, brilliantly curated, by the way. And there's evidence to suggest that the son, that he was the biological son of Manet's wife, Suzanne, if you don't know this. And the question is, was Manet actually his father? And some people think that it might have been Manet's father, who was a judge, a seriously high-ranking judge who, you know, ironically oversaw paternity cases sometimes, who may have been the father, because Suzanne, Manet's wife, had been brought into the Manet household as a piano teacher. She was a very gifted piano player, and at some point she's become pregnant, and so the whole question of who the father actually was is a very alive one, and so I'd have to ask about that as well. And I can't think of a third.
Tell us a bit about what's stuck in your head that you want to write about. What's the germ of the next book that you're thinking about? You're not supposed to ask this question of a writer, I know, but I'm just curious if there's some little problem in your head that you want to explore, or an artist that's stuck somewhere.
Well, I'll probably try and fail to write a novel, since that's still my dream. But you know, this book, it was linked in a way to one of the 4 chapters in my earlier book, The Art of Rivalry, because that chapter is about the relationship between Manet and Degas through the 1860s, and Berthe Morisot plays a really important role in that. So that's when I first started to get my head around Berthe Morisot. And, you know, I could sort of go to the next chapter, but I think...
I'm not committing you to do that, but what is the next chapter?
Well,
what comes
I was
after
going to say,
that?
I don't think I will try to do that because Manet dies, and you know, Morisot's life from that point on is actually very interesting, and she moves in a fascinating literary and artistic circle, but it's a bit blighted by tragedy. I mean, just one person after another in her life dies. Even in this picture, she's wearing black because her father had just died. But you know, I think if I look at other artistic figures that I feel I know a lot about already, because you know, I think just given the nature of my main job, it's very difficult to plunge into a subject about which I know nothing. But one subject I feel I know quite a lot about is Matisse, and I love Matisse and his paintings so much. And not that I want to become a specialist in artists during periods of war, but I think that the most fascinating period, one of the most fascinating periods of Matisse's career is from around 1913 to 1917. So it overlaps with the First World War. And knowing a little bit, having read the Hilary Sperling biography, the great 2-volume Hilary Sperling biography of Matisse, I have a better sense of what was going on in his life then, and the fact that his mother, for instance, was behind enemy lines. He tried to enlist himself, but he couldn't. He and his wife did a great deal to support artist friends who had enlisted and were fighting during this unbelievably terrible conflict. And at the same time, he was innovating like no other artist had innovated. You know, I mean, don't mean to use superlatives, but yeah, innovating on an incredible level. Just, it's still staggering to me to see the paintings he produced during that period. And it, you know, culminates in masterpieces like the piano lesson in MoMA and, you know, the Moroccans and a whole bunch of other things. And they're such mysterious, you know, paintings, but drenchingly colorful and sensuous, but during this incredibly difficult time. And I think one of the criticisms of Matisse has always been, oh, well, you know, he lived through these traumatic events, but he kept painting these pretty pictures. How can we take him seriously? At least Picasso was, you know, joining the Communist Party and painting in dark colors and so on. And I feel like that's such a simplistic way to look at things. And to me, Matisse was heroic through this period on a moral level as well as an aesthetic level. And I'm tempted to try to sort of write something about that. But now I really feel I am on the couch, so I'll shut up.
But you said you often write on the couch. So,
That's
just
true.
saying, okay? So, so when you go into an exhibition that's of a contemporary artist, you're not, I'm asserting this and maybe you'll respond. You're not compelled to understand biography. When you go into a historical show as a writer, you do tend to ground yourself in certain facts to understand context. So talk a little bit about, as an art critic, your anxiety about not knowing enough or making certain assumptions, and that difference between contemporary and historical, if that assumption is correct.
Yeah, I mean, I've thought a lot about this. I don't know if there's a difference between contemporary and historical. I think I'm always interested in artists' motivations, whether they're living right now or, you know, one of the projects I did during COVID, which got in the way of, you know, getting some momentum going with this book, was writing I spent 9 months writing an oral history of a video work that I love called The Visitors. It's by an Icelandic artist called Ragnar Kjartansson, and it was a sort of group project where, you know, 12 musicians got together and played. Some of you will have seen it. It's an amazing work. But I interviewed everyone involved in that piece, and they were all in Reykjavik in their homes, so it was all done by Zoom because we couldn't travel. But I loved getting inside their heads, the motivations for how that piece came about. So that's always interesting to me, as is historical context. And, you know, we're living in history right now, so I'm interested in the context in which things are getting created right now, of course. But I'm also someone who believes that you don't need to know. Like, if a work is successful, hopefully you can just go in and have an experience with it. And that was certainly the case for me with The Visitors. When I first saw it, I knew nothing about it in advance. I didn't know anything much about Matisse's The Piano Lesson when I first saw that picture, but I remember being absolutely knocked sideways by it. And so I think the two things are important to keep in mind. You know, I love, you know, and it plays out in, and you'd have much more intelligent things to say about this than I think, but it plays out in the way we think about museum presentations. You know, I love the fact that in so many cities in America and elsewhere, you'll have a big encyclopedic museum like this, which is sort of, has many raison d'etres, but one of them is education and enlightenment. And then it'll often be very close to another museum that's a more sort of private house museum kind of thing, like the Gardner here. Or you have the National Gallery and the Phillips Collection. Or you have, you know, in London, you have, you know, the National Gallery or Tate and then the Wallace Collection. I could go on and on and on. Even contemporary versions of this, you have, you know, in DC, you have Glenstone and the National Gallery. And they both represent totally different styles of looking at art. And I think they're both great. I love them both. I think one of the things I love about the Gardner and some of these other smaller museums is that there's not the same sort of educational pressure. There's an impulse to encourage people to come in and have an experience. I almost said just have an experience, but it's not just, right? It can be profound and life-changing. To go in, to really not know anything. I love this with I mean, I remember, I might have told you this before, Matthew, but I remember coming here with a school group when my son was in 5th grade. He went to a Somerville public school, and a friend and I brought the kids here. And I remember, you know, there's a class of kids, many of them hadn't been to any museum before. And we walked into the Japanese sculpture gallery, which was darkened and theatrical, amazing gallery. And this kid came up to me, and you know, I just said, look, I want you to just have 5 minutes in here and the next door gallery where there was some netsuke, I think. And I said to them, I want you to come back after 5 minutes and we'll all talk about what we've seen. And I want you to say the smallest thing you've seen and the biggest thing you've seen. And, you know, the smallest with the netsuke and the biggest with the sculptures. But the most amazing thing happened. This little kid, when we were in the darkened room with those guardian figures, quite scary with light projecting shadows behind them, this kid came up to me and he tugged my sleeve. He said, Tom's dad. That was, you know, that's, my son is called Tom. He didn't know my actual name. Tom's dad, what should I do? And you know, he was out of his mind with excitement, but he was sort of scared as well, and he hadn't been in a museum. And I thought, wow, he's going to remember that for the rest of his life. Just seeing these amazing works of art, which were centuries old and so dramatic, and I wanted to say, I didn't want to say go read the label, you know, I wanted to say just sort of nothing, it's fine, just let's talk about it if you want, but isn't it amazing, you know, and that's a feeling that I hope that we all can, not just as kids, but we can all hold on to. Not to always feel the pressure to know all the context and the history and all the biographical things. You don't need that. It can be there, and I think it enriches things the deeper you look, of course. But there's something about that immediate experience that I really value. And you know, when we think of music, I think we have no hesitation in valuing that. You know, we want to have that visceral experience. But I think it's there with art too. Sorry, that was a really long answer.
No, and I'm going to build on that and ask you a last question. But before I do, since we did the couch thing a little bit, my tutor at the Courtauld, who knew Pierre Matisse very well, Pierre Matisse hated the piano lesson. Really? Because it represented all the time his father didn't spend with him because he had to practice the piano.
I think he was really strict about practice, Matisse, wasn't he?
Yes.
Yeah.
So it's an interesting thing.
That's amazing.
Whenever
I had
see
no
the
idea.
piano,
Yeah.
I think that. So, but let's do some work of thinking about a work of art in front of us right now as we finish up, and just think about one or two works at the MFA a museum you love, and you love many things here, but conjure up a moment when you saw something and it really just got to you. Put the biography aside, the history aside, and you stood and you just looked, and just talk to us about what that looking was like.
I can't remember if you forewarned me about this and I've just failed to prepare, or it's just a test of thinking on my feet. You know, there's a painting by, maybe it's just having this picture up earlier, you know, it makes me think of views of people from behind. There's a painting in the MFA collection that I really love, by Gerard ter Borch, or Borch, or, you know, my Dutch accent's not so great, but he's a painter I really love, almost as much as Vermeer, actually. I mean, he's done so many paintings that have really moved me. But one of them here at the MFA is quite unusual. It shows a soldier, and he's seen from behind, a bit like this. There's something about seeing people from behind sometimes, isn't there? That it's almost easier to project yourself emotionally into them, even though you can't see their face. It's almost contradictory, but you can imagine yourself being in their shoes, looking out at what you can see behind them. But this painting shows a soldier in armor on a horse. The horse is foreshortened. It's going away from us, so we really just see it's you know, the rump, is that the right phrase? And it's just beautifully painted. We can see the glint of the armor a little bit, but above all, there's a feeling of tiredness and lethargy, and almost a feeling of retreat from the battle, maybe hopefully back to something better in peaceful life. But it has a feeling of dejection and poignancy about it that is somehow leavened, almost in the way Chekhov's stories can be, by a sense of being immersed in actual life, you know, where not everything's great, but it doesn't all have to be despair and dejection. There's no, you know, sometimes with expressionistic art, for instance, there can be, I admire a lot of that sort of art, but there can be a kind of rhetoric of extremism, as if everything is happening in a crisis. There's something about this painting that it may be a crisis. He may have just been on the side that was defeated in battle, or he may have just been at sort of, you know, cavalry drill, and he's just, you know, going back to the barracks. It's very hard to say, but it's got a beautiful, you know, tender feeling to it, and I just love it. How did I do?
You're going to come back next week. We'll have
Sure.
you back next week. Listen, thank you, everybody, for coming, and thank you, Sebastian, for such a thoughtful and engaging way of talking about what you do and what means so much to you in the work that you do. I think that great writers, and you are a great writer, the great writer helps us see something different, but also awakens something in us about our own creativity and thinking and relating to things. And I think you do both. You help us see differently, and you awaken a creative something inside of all of us. So
thank you
for
so
sharing your
much,
thoughts.
Matthew, for those kind words and for interviewing me or chatting with me here today. I've enjoyed it so much. Thank you.
Terrific.
Thank you. And thank you all for coming.